Professor Saldana. So before starting, let's start introduction. I am Kishore More from GD Park Center. I am doing my PhD in History Department.
Surendra Dondre, Department of Civics and Politics.
I'm Wilhelm Engineer, Center for Study of Society and Sections.
I'm Rachel De Silva, Center for Study of Society and Sections.
Surendra Pandey, I work at a software company as a consultant.
I'm Satvik Koyaskar, studying in MA.
Abhilasha, ISA.
Deepak Salve, activist. Denzel Saldana, I'm on the board of the Indian Institute.
Dhananjay, CPIML.
Anil Sawant, Satyashodha Resource.
Kunda PM, Satyashodha Resource.
BK Giri, IIA.
Shivanand Giri, I'm a chartered accountant and I'm on the board of the IIA.
CPIML, Shangway.
Sanjeevani Kulika, Department of Civics and Politics. Krishna Rana, Department of Civics. Sandhya Bhandre, Center for Study of Society and Secularism and Economic Strategy.
Okay. I request Aruna Giri ma'am to introduce GD Park Center, and then we have a talk.
Good afternoon, friends. Well, GD Parikh Center, maybe some of you know, or I do not know whether you do or you do not know about GD Parikh, who was rector of the last rector of the Mumbai University. The center was started in his name by JP and Chitra Naik. About Chitra and JP Naik, founders of this IIE institute that we belong to. Well, let me start with JP Naik. He came from a rural background. His education was completed with the help of a relative because he couldn't afford even to go to school after the 7th class. So he seen the rural India, came from that part of Kolhapur district where he was really in a farmer's family where his parents could not give him the fair amount of education that is needed to get a job. So he came to Kolhapur. And this was JP Naik. Well, since I have been given only 5 minutes, I would just link up today's subject with one sentence, from one of the books that were written by one of the friends of JP, Baburao Joshi from Kolhapur. And this sentence was, this was about education, alternatives, and how Naik Sahab spent his school days, college days, and his working life in Kolhapur. So, in that book, there is a sentence by JP Naik that every child in India should be fed, should be clothed, and medically treated. The government should look after his health and his or her health. And something that is so very important for all of us is that he or she should be given the freedom to think for himself or herself about what to do in life. So when you say what to do, what to say, what not to say, so that freedom I think we're talking about today, and it is very, very essential that given today's circumstances where maybe we feel that we don't have the freedom, how to get that freedom, what is freedom, how much freedom, if too much of freedom is given, maybe some governments don't like it, they want to gag people. If you gag people too much, what happens? If you give too much of freedom, what happens? And we're all on this continuum. We feel where there's, too much freedom on one side and fascism on the other side. So how much of what is required and in what kind of society? This is what JP Naik, Chitra Naik thought about continuously. They thought about, This because all this is to be reflected in education. The alternatives to the present system of education, the philosophy that we put into that education. And governments come and go, change. But then what do we do with the system of education, the philosophy of education? I think this is what is important, and I thank our speaker of today, Dr. Banaji, for having accepted our invitation, and he's chosen a very interesting topic. I thank our chairman, Sharad Behasa, for having found time to come to Mumbai, and I thank all of you for having come here to listen to a very interesting speech, and there will be a debate after that.
I'm requesting Irfan Engineer to introduce our guest speaker. Of course, many of you is activists and know him by his work, but formal introduction from you and relevance of this type of activity in current situation.
Friends, many of you have been attending study circles organized by CSS. There have been breaks and continuities. We organize a series of them. The whole intention behind the study circle is that we become thinking people, not propagandists, as today's government wants us to be just propagandists on the map. We think differently, alternatively, critically, grow up together, reach out to young people and build an alternative India, a democratic India, where there is equality, justice, rights for everyone. As education is important, as health is important for children, I'm taking cue from Banaji. Mental health is also as important, and education is all about that. Education is not about just receiving wisdom of many generations ago, but exploring our world ourselves. So with this intention, we have study circles. Last month we had Professor R.B. Bhagat. He spoke about census data, making sense of census 2011 and religion. Because religion is politicized and census figures are politicized. And he gave a very fair sense of how to look at census and census data, how census is a political instrument, has been used as a political instrument by ruling dispensations. Today's speaker is Jairus Banaji. I won't spend much time introducing him. Most of us know him, associated with SOAS, UK, London, teaching there, doing research. His subjects of research are Marxian subjects, economy, history, economic history, agrarian economy, and many other topics. He's a very popular resource person for our study circles. He has come many times before. We had a series of study circle on dialectical materialism, along with a series of 3 lectures, and we are continuing it. We are happy to have him. More than he's not just an intellectual, but a passionate one, a passionate activist, if I may say so. Always happy to be with young activists like me and like all of us, like some of us here. So without wasting much time, I would request him to.
Okay, thanks, Irfan. I thought the point of drawing attention to this book by Reich, which is called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. This is not a very good translation, but it's the only one that people ever read in English. If you get around to reading Reich, you'll probably read this. There's one on the net which is much better by someone called Wolf. This actually often distorts the language of Reich's original text. But anyway, it's the only one that's accessible or available other than the one that's on the net. So I've drawn about 10 excerpts from the first 2 chapters. Anyone who's interested in, does anyone want copies of this,
Yeah,
these
we have
excerpts?
circulated this on net, but
Huh?
still, anybody who wants it.
If you like it, they're here. While there is anyone who's particularly interested.
Thank you. Just a copy, please. Thank you.
We'll give it here. Anybody who wants it.
Yeah, you can take it. Go ahead.
Okay. So what I thought I'd do is draw attention to the significance of this, largely in terms of our own experience in India today. I'm sure none of us have heard the word Vikas uttered more times than in, say, the last year to year and a half. Can you ever remember in the history of India's independent development hearing this word Vikas uttered more often? I mean, what's going on? Everyone knows that the struggle of post-colonial third world countries is a struggle in some sense to develop, quote unquote. Everyone knows that. It's a banal, commonplace fact. But suddenly a fetish has been created out of this idea of development. A fetish has been created, and it's as if no one can ever say anything in the electoral arena which somehow distances himself or herself from this fetish of development. Okay? So what is going on? And I'd like to start by suggesting that in this book that Erich Fromm published in 1942, Fromm was also sort of had a psychological background, Reich, and was one of the very few people from psychology or psychoanalysis to actually deal with the problem of fascism. This was published in 1942. It's called The Fear of Freedom, and doubtless a lot of you have read it. He narrates a simple example of the difference between actually thinking and what he calls pseudo-thinking. That is the activity of thought as an actual activity which you experience, and pseudo-thinking. It's a very simple example. It's a coastal tourist destination of some sort, and you imagine someone is wanting to know what the weather is going to be like the next day. So this person quite randomly asks 2 people. One is a fisherman who lives there. What's the weather going to be like tomorrow? Now the fisherman tries to give an answer based on his experience. He looks at the sky and various signs of what the weather is going to be like today, and says it's most likely going to rain or something like that, based on his experience. There is a rather pompous middle-class type of tourist living in the hotel, who is the other person that this inquirer asks, what's the weather going to be like today? Now this guy has actually watched the news. Okay? He gives the broadcaster's version of the weather tomorrow as if it is his own. Okay? And he does so in a sententious and pompous way. I think it's going to be really hot tomorrow. And I suspect the temperature is going to be somewhere close to 35, and so on and so on, in this rather pompous. Now, the point that Fromm makes is, the fisherman could very well be wrong. The weather there may be no rain the next day. It may be scorching hot. It may well be 35 degrees. But what matters is that the fisherman was thinking. Okay? What matters is not whether he's going to be right or wrong, but he was thinking and basing his answer on experience and introspection and everything he knows about the area and the weather. Whereas this rather pompous middle-class tourist is palming off the weather forecast as if it's his own opinion and simply basing it on what is being received through the television. And it's what Reich calls, what Fromm calls pseudo-thinking. So the difference between thought as a real activity and pseudo-thinking, thought as this kind of fictitious activity, it seems to me quite relevant to our situation in India today. Because the other question you might want to ask is, what's the difference between public opinion and popular opinion? Have you ever thought about it? These 2 terms seem very close to each other. Public opinion and popular opinion. Now, the kind of literature on German fascism, and in particular Ian Kershaw, who's a historian of Nazism, was particularly fascinated by the distinction and wrote a whole book about public opinion and popular opinion under the Nazis. Public opinion, he says, is the opinion which is constructed for you. It circulates like some enshrined object. It's a top-down process. You are meant to internalize it, but in any case, it has a kind of inertness about it. It's hard to change public opinion. It has an inertia about it. Popular opinion is that messy middle ground, confused middle ground, where people are actually expressing ideas and views. There's no coherence in popular opinion necessarily. It's not a structure of coherence. It's very messy, but it's what people say based on their local experiences. And if they're living in a regime which is one of terror, of intimidation, of informers, they may not actually want to express what they really feel and what they really think. So popular opinion tends to be driven underground in fascist regimes. It doesn't come up to the surface except in a very private way, in the privacy of your home, possibly in the privacy of your neighborhood or of some association you belong to, of a union, etc. You might voice the views you hold about Hitler or whatever. But public opinion is what is constructed for you, and it's the opinion that dominates, so to speak. This again is related to the distinction that Fromm makes between thinking as an activity, our ability to think critically, and pseudo-thinking. And unfortunately, it seems to me that what Vikas demonstrates is the enormous capacity we seem to have in India to simply accept uncritically, all right, discourses and concepts and ideas and slogans and fetishes which are handed down to us, and then regurgitate them, recycle them in our conversations and so on and so forth, without the ability to stand back for 1 minute and ask, what is this all about? A simple question. Because actually this emperor who is roaming up and down India and today, nowadays, up and down Bihar, is completely without clothes. I mean, that is why he will not engage in public debate. That is why he will not have news conferences where the questions are unanticipated and unpredictable. Because if he is suddenly asked by some sharp journalist, now just name the 5 things that matter most about development in your eyes, or how with the appalling levels of public investment in health, of central government expenditure in the public health system, do you expect to have even your Make in India workforce living a healthy life? How do you expect the reproduction of labor power to take place, in any viable way with the kind of public health system we have in India, which is practically a zero public health? And now increasingly more and more health is being privatized. I don't think Mr. Modi will be able to answer those kinds of questions, frankly, in a spontaneous way. Even when he interacted with Zuckerberg in wherever it was, San Jose, he had an already choreographed set of answers. Okay? So there was no spontaneity in what was going on there. And I think Zuckerberg sensed that. For a start, he chose to speak in Hindi when he's okay in English. He can articulate his views in English, but he chose to speak in Hindi as a sort of protection. And secondly, there was nothing spontaneous in his interaction, either with the audience or with Zuckerberg himself. This lack of spontaneity is an important characteristic of a particular character structure. I want to suggest that. It's the kind of character structure that people like Reich and Fromm are trying to deal with. Now, what I'll do in the presentation is break this up into 3 parts. The third part can be a discussion where I'd like the remarks that I make in part 2 in particular to see if those remarks have any kind of resonance in terms of the society we live in India today and in terms of our social and political experience. So part 3 in some sense is really our collective discussion and India. Part 2 is the argument that Reich makes in the mass psychology of fascism. And part 1, which is very brief, is just a set of introductory remarks about Reich himself and the context in which he was working, and in particular the terrible role that Freud played in relation to Reich. Freud had enormous standing in Germany at the time, but he absolutely refused to help Reich. What makes Reich unique, particularly among major thinkers on the left, is that he was First of all, he was the only psychoanalyst in Germany who was stripped of German citizenship. Secondly, he was probably the only major public figure who suffered 2 spectacular expulsions in the course of 1 year. He was thrown out of the German Psychoanalytic Society, which is Freud's own society, in 1933. In the middle of 1933, he was expelled. And unless you are a member of one of the national societies, psychoanalytic societies, then you are automatically expelled from the International Association of Psychoanalysts. So he was automatically expelled from the International Association. That means he had no right to attend their conferences anymore, and his articles would not be published in any journals associated with them. So it was quite a major blow to Reich to be expelled from the German Psychoanalytic Society, which happened in 1933. A few months later, he was expelled from the German Communist Party, the KPD. And why? Basically because he published this book, Mass Psychology of Fascism. Reich started to work on the mass psychology of fascism sometime around 1931. And he himself says that he had no real sense of what fascism was all about until he, in the period 1928 to 1930, he had no real sense of what fascism was about till this period, 1931 to 33, when he began to actually work in what he called sexpol. Now, the sexpol clinics which Reich set up, Reich was an Austrian by birth and by nationality, and Austria was not occupied by the Nazis till 1938 in that famous acquisition of Austria, which is called the Anschluss. That didn't happen till 1938. Reich spent the most of his youth in Vienna in the 1920s till he left for Berlin at the very end of the 1920s. And Berlin had a freer atmosphere at the time. What he did in Berlin was set up sexpol clinics, because Reich was a psychoanalyst, but unlike Freud, he was much more interested in therapy than in theory. Of the two things, of theory and therapy, Freud was deeply embroiled in theoretical production, so to speak. Reich's real interest in theory was insofar as it helped with therapy. So he was always more practical in his approach. And he set up these clinics together with certain other left-wing psychoanalysts in Berlin, sometime towards the end of the 20s, I think, and thousands of quote-unquote patients began to attend them. I don't know what the right word for them is. But to give you an idea of what was going on, for example, in 1931, 1 million, that's a staggering figure, 1 million illegal abortions took place in Germany, of which 44% were fatal. So this gives you some sense of the scale on which quote-unquote sexual neuroses of various types or problems related to sexual health and family health were rampant within German society in the early 30s. That you should have 1 million illegal abortions, of which close to half were fatal. Okay, so the clinics were actually grappling with the sort of problems that women and youth, above all, these were the two target categories for Reich. Women and youth were having to face within your typical German household, within the typical German family, and the broader society with its particular sanctions against abortion, for example, or ideas about sexuality, ideas about the family, ideas about the home, ideas about the role of women, ideas about authority and submission to authority, and so on and so forth. I mean, among the various films that have been made about Nazism, undoubtedly the best is one which is called Murder is My Trade. That's the French translated when the film was shown. It's a German film, but when it was shown in France, it was shown under this particular title, Murder is My Trade. It's about a concentration camp commander. But it's not about the work that he does in the concentration camp, it's about his childhood and how he came to be the kind of Nazi commander that he turned out to be in the 1930s. And it is an absolutely stunning kind of insight into the trajectory of a Nazi, because he grows up in a completely authoritarian family where the father is a horrific figure, a figure of violence and authority. Okay? He grows up as in a kind of completely loveless atmosphere. And it's a farm household, maybe somewhere in East Germany. And what the film does is to trace the evolution, the biography of this person until he becomes a Nazi, and then until he, then he becomes, his job in the Nazi state is to become a concentration camp commander. So what's interesting about the film is that it links childhood to Nazism, okay? Which is something, which is a link that is not made in a foregrounded and visible way, because you tend to think of Nazism, first of all, as something political, something to do with the state, something to do with public life, but none of that would work if people were not children and if they were not impacted as children by ideas which make them Nazis. Who produces Nazis? Where do Nazis come from? And it's a question you can ask about India today. Where do all these people come from who are active in similar right-wing movements and activities today? Where do they come from? That was the kind of question that Reich was trying to grapple with. And as he himself points out, as long as he was in Vienna and hadn't got actively involved in sexual political work, namely the kind of work that he was experiencing in these clinics, he had no idea what the real roots of the Nazification of German society were, of Faschisierung or whatever, the making fascist of that entire society. So he began to work on the mass psychology of fascism as early as 1931 and began to deliver lectures based on the book, but the book itself was not published in 1933. And it has run through 3 editions, and those editions were successively revised, and the worst one in some ways is the one that was ultimately translated into English, which is the 1945 edition, I think. The 45 edition is the one that finally comes out in English. It's a much expanded version or text of the one that Reich published originally in 1933. And the first line of the preface of the 1933 edition is, "The German working class has suffered a severe defeat." Now remember, September 1933 is when he publishes the first edition of the Mass Psychology of Fascism. By February that year, the Nazis have swept into power. By February. So anyone thinking that, is it reasonable to say in a book published in September 1933 that the German working class has suffered a severe defeat, is he right or wrong? But for that, particularly for that sentiment, he was expelled from the German Communist Party. For the idea that somehow the victory of fascism, the victory of Hitler at the polls, when I think they got something like 17 million votes, that was a defeat for the labor movement, a defeat for social democracy, a defeat for the German Communist Party. That idea was denounced. So the tensions had begun to build up already by the end of 1932 between the communists and Reich. Reich was a member of the party. He was an active communist. He was active in a field which the communists by and large neglected, which is sex-ball work. These clinics which were attracting thousands of patients, mainly from working class suburbs in Berlin. And he was getting to find out what the real problems were that they confronted in day-to-day life. And Reich was unique because he believed that the left would not succeed unless it could integrate cultural politics into its revolutionary work in a fundamental way. Make cultural politics absolutely central to its socialist message. That unless it was able to do that, it would not succeed. And he's absolutely right. The experience of subsequent decades has proved it. Who in the end made culture and cultural politics central to the left? Not the left. It was the feminists. It was feminism which did that by foregrounding the oppression of women and therefore bringing the family into the picture, behind the family, patriarchy into the picture, and a whole history and culture of patriarchy, which is not peculiar to capitalism, predates capitalism by centuries, but which is not abolished by capitalism, which is not superseded by capitalism, which is internalized and re-articulated by capitalism. That lesson, that central message, is something that we owe to the feminist struggles of the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s. It was the feminists who brought cultural politics center stage. But it was a lesson that was anticipated in some form by Reich and by Reich's work. And so therefore Reich has had a significant influence on post-war feminism as well. The only person who dissents from that view, who doesn't dissent from that view, who agrees with that view, but finds it a deleterious, a damaging influence on feminism, is Juliet Mitchell. She published a book in 1974 called Psychoanalysis and Feminism. Now she's scathing about Reich. She's scathing about him. She devotes something like 100 pages to Reich in that book. What is she scathing about? That he deviates from Freud's orthodoxy. First of all, Juliet Mitchell imagines that there is a Freudian orthodoxy, when there isn't. There's no such thing as a Freudian orthodoxy. Even his closest collaborators put forward ideas which Freud wouldn't have accepted. Okay? So first of all, there's a myth that there's something called a Freudian. But Juliet Mitchell comes down heavily on Reich because apparently he misunderstands certain fundamental concepts and categories within Freud's work. Okay? That is actually a plus point for Reich. Reich assimilated Freud in a critical way. What he accepted from Freud was the notion of infantile sexuality. The idea that sexuality is not something that somehow suddenly bursts onto the scene when you're an adolescent or an adult, but it is there from childhood. In some form, in some complex form, it is part of our life experience from childhood. Okay? So the notion of infantile sexuality is accepted from Freud. What is rejected emphatically by Freud, by Reich, is Freud's idea of the death drive. That somehow in psychology, the unconscious and human civilization is defined by something that Freud calls the Todestriebe, the death instinct, a death wish or a death drive. And Freud tries to explain all the violence and chaos in human history in terms of something that is psychologically intrinsic, namely the death drive. Reich, being a person of the left, emphatically rejected that view. He had a much more optimistic view about human beings. Okay? So, I mean, I'm simplifying enormously, but these two key Freudian ideas, one he accepts, one he rejects. So his relationship to Freud was always critical. It was one of critical assimilation, not dogmatic assimilation, not simply parroting what Freud has said. But nonetheless, Juliet Mitchell finds it offensive that he should depart from Freud's theories and ideas and, and so on. And then the rest of the book is spent dealing with the feminists who have been influenced by Reich. And she acknowledges Reich's influence on the feminist movement. So she deals with Kate Millett and not with Brown Miller, because Brown Miller's book on rape came out later. But who are the great writers? Greer, Germaine Greer, and so on and so forth. All of them. She takes about 4 major feminist thinkers, all of them deeply influenced by Reich, and slams each one of them. So Reich spent most of the 30s fleeing from country to country. Because if he were back in Germany, he would have been interned and basically killed. He would have been killed had he been back in Germany. So he fled. He fled in 1933. He was in fact in Denmark when the first edition of the Mass Psychology of Fascism was published. He only got to know about his expulsion from the German Communist Party when he was on a 6-month tourist visa in Denmark. The Danish government refused to extend his visa. He had to go off to either Norway or Sweden. He kept running from country to country, hunted, persecuted, having suffered a double expulsion, one as a communist, one as a psychoanalyst. So he had no associations left, meaning in terms of professional life, he had no associations left at that stage. Ultimately, he ends up in the US in 1939 or 40. He manages to get a visa. He goes across to the States, and there too, he then finds he's under surveillance from the FBI. The FBI keeps him under rigorous surveillance because he was a member of the German Communist Party at some stage in the late 20s and early 30s. So the FBI are after him. And then eventually he dies in an American prison in 1956 or 7. He dies in an American jail. What a paradox. All right. The country that finally accepts him, gives him asylum or whatever, is the same country where he dies in a jail. And his books were burnt, not just by the Nazis in 1933, in the famous round of book burnings. Okay? They were also burnt by the FBI. They made a huge heap, a pile of all the literature, and publicly burnt all of Reich's work to show that he was regarded as a dangerous person by that stage. So people found Reich extremely threatening, including Freud. And when Freud was asked, when he was about to be externed from Denmark, Freud was asked to help, to intercede with his authority. He absolutely refused to do so, and the grounds given are extremely interesting. Freud wrote back to this person who appealed to him to help Reich. He wrote back to him saying, "I find Reich's views extreme."
Extreme?
Yes. So you refuse to help someone because you find their views extreme? Now, the sinister part of this whole, the underbelly of Freud's attitude to fascism is that there's a guy called Peglau, a German scholar called Peglau. He has done a systematic search for the words fascism, Nazism, anti-Semitism through all the psychoanalytic journals and literature and writing throughout the 1930s. Not one hit. Not one hit. The psychoanalysts were systematically quiet about fascism and Nazism. Freud himself was publicly absolutely quiet about fascism. He lost 2 sisters in the concentration camps, but he would not utter a word against the Nazi regime. Not even in his letters do you find criticisms of fascism. Okay? It's as if what's at work is classically the mechanism that he himself calls repression. It's as if a whole part of his life is being deliberately suppressed or repressed. He doesn't want to have to confront the horror of fascism. That makes Reich unique again. He was the only psychoanalyst who had the guts to confront, the guts and the intellectual imagination to grapple with fascism and to confront fascism. So much for these preliminary remarks about Reich as an individual. He had an extremely tragic life, it seems to me, because he was hounded out of Germany, stripped of German citizenship, expelled from the various psychoanalytic associations, expelled from the German Communist Party. And, in the end, he becomes very anti-Stalinist, and a kind of anti-Stalinism which could be confused with anti-communism. That happens in the 1940s and 1950s. He's constantly writing absurd letters to the American state saying that I think I'm being watched by the KGB and this, that, and the other. They don't take him seriously. And as I say, he died in an American jail. Now, the first two chapters of Mass Psychology of Fascism, it seems to me, are where the substance of an interesting insight into Nazism is laid out by Reich. And some of these excerpts are the more insightful parts of the first two chapters. Yeah. So this is how I thought what you can do is look at the excerpts and what Reich says there a bit later on, but essentially chapters 1 and 2, it seems to me, contain perspectives that are immensely relevant to our situation in India today. Chapter 1 is called Ideology as a Material Force, and chapter 2 is called The Authoritarian Ideology of the Family in the Mass Psychology of Fascism. So Reich makes the family central to fascism, point number 1. But he doesn't make just any abstract family central to fascism. He makes the authoritarian family central to fascism. It's as if it's the nuts and bolts of fascism. Okay? You want to ask, how do we explain Hindutva in India today? Well, we have to look at the Indian family. We have to. Okay? So the authoritarian ideology of the family in the Mass Psychology of Fascism, chapter 2, ideology as a material force, chapter 1. Reich is clearly trying to get away from the idea that somehow, ideas have little to do, that ideas are somehow kind of spiritual entities, abstract entities, or mental entities. He's trying to get you to see that ideas, whatever we mean by the term, however we define them, are actually rooted, very deeply embedded in experience. I mean, whether we are conscious of those ideas or not conscious about them, the important thing is that they stem from our experience. And as when Sartre says about people on the left that they're often ashamed of their subjectivity, it's because they don't talk enough about themselves. He found this a very irritating characteristic of French left-wing intellectuals, that they refuse to talk about themselves. They would talk about everything under the sun, grand ideas and grand concepts and so on, but not look at themselves or even say what their families were like, what they felt about their dad, for example. Okay? I mean, you ask them, so what was your dad like? They might just completely clam up. After you've heard a lecture of half an hour about the economic crisis or something or other, they would clam up. And I don't know whether the left in India is like that, but it's a dangerous characteristic. Not to be, in some sense, in sync with your own subjectivity. Because it makes more sense to live your life in an integrated way than in this peculiarly split and disintegrated way. It makes more sense to be aware of your own biography, your life experiences, and your subjectivity in that sense. So what I'd like to suggest is that there are 3 essential ideas that run like a sort of undercurrent through those first 2 chapters. I mean, that's the best way of summing up. I've called them motifs. Motifs in the sense that they're like kind of potential themes which can be developed. And I'd just read out a bit to describe what I see as the 3 essential kind of motifs that run through chapters 1 and 2. Now, in writing The Mass Psychology of Fascism, something he started to do in 1931, the problem that confronted Reich was, why do the working masses allow themselves to be mobilized into movements that are manifestly opposed to their economic interests? Very relevant question today in India. Why do the working masses allow themselves to be mobilized into movements that are opposed to their economic interests? This riddle, he argued, could not be solved, quote unquote, economically. In other words, there was no economic explanation for this riddle. Try as hard as you like, political economy will not give you the answer to this riddle. So where does the solution lie? On the other hand, if the solution to the riddle lay in ideology, and that is where Reich said the solution lies, in ideology, if the solution to the riddle lay in ideology, we would have to explain what this actually could mean. What does it mean? What could it mean to say that actually the riddle is solved if you look at ideology? And that is what Reich set out to do by making the family central to the kind of subjectivity presupposed by fascism. The great themes that Reich develops in mass psychology can be summed up in what, to me, are the three main vectors that run through the first two chapters of the book. They're like kind of potential arguments that are leading us forward into a full-scale debate. But the tragedy is that that debate has not happened on the left. Socialist discussion has ignored these three particular themes. One, the conception of ideology as a material force. The German word for force here is Gewalt, which is ambiguous because it can equally well mean violence, it can mean power, or it can mean force. It has that ambivalence. There is no single English word that I'm aware of that contains all three meanings: violence, power, force. But Gewalt has that. Okay? So ideology is a material force. What does he mean by that? Now, you know, again, in the historical materialist tradition, there is a simple explanation for what is meant by saying ideology is a material force. It's when an idea grips the masses. Remember that famous phrase? Whether it's Marxist phrase, I don't know, but when an idea grips the masses, that is supposed to be the explanation for this. Ideology is Reich wants to go deeper than that. He doesn't disagree with that, but he wants to go deeper than that. So for Reich, what it means to talk about, to characterize ideology as a material force, is to talk about the biopsychological, bio in the sense that it affects our lives, okay, our biologies, biopsychological grounding of ideology in the psychic structures molded by family, by tradition, and by a repressed and often brutalized sexuality. This is the kind of relationship that makes ideology a material force, namely that it's not up there in the air. Ideology is not. It is biopsychologically rooted, grounded in psychic structures. If you like, psychological structures, because the word psychic in English often refers to paranormal psychology and, you know, the other world and so on and so forth. But it was standardly used by the Freudians and psychoanalysts to mean psychological. So when I say psychic, I mean psychological. Psychic structures molded by whom? That is where Reich departs quite substantially from Freud, molded by social forces. Okay? So the Oedipus complex for Reich is not something that's timeless, eternal, and inextricable from human history. It's something shaped by the forces of culture and human history for Reich. He gives it a kind of historical material dimension. So the grounding of ideology in psychic structures molded by family, by tradition. I've put tradition in quotes. Think of the Khap Panchayats. Okay? Tradition. Could you get a purer incarnation of tradition in India than the Khap Panchayats? They are what tradition is all about. They are tradition speaking, so to speak. Okay? And by a repressed and often brutalized sexuality. That's the sexuality of the child molded within the authoritarian family, funneled in certain ways, channeled in certain ways, distorted, and so on and so forth. Two, the second vector, so to speak, that runs through these things, patriarchy and the authoritarian family as the mainstay of the state's power. This is what possibly pedantic Marxists at the time might have found a bit shocking. To say that the basis of the state's power lies not in, say, capital, in the power of capital, but lies in the authoritarian family. The deepest root of the authority of the state, he says, lies in the family. Not in capitalist production, not in the accumulation of capital, not in the state apparatuses, not in the state as a machine of oppression. It lies in the family. So what, in a sense, Reich has done is internalize the family into the state. which is something you will notice that Althusser does in his book on ideological state apparatuses. Althusser does it, but he does it in a completely different way to Reich. You know, when you read Althusser about the state apparatuses, and you're again back into a kind of metaphysics. It's very hard to understand in a practical, concrete way what Althusser means by all these state apparatuses. But for Reich, it's very clear that the family is a central moment of the state, the authoritarian family. So as the mainstay of the state's power. And thirdly, the third idea that's worth looking at is this: he constructs a resonance between the authoritarian character structure, the one that is molded by the family, in the family, shaped within this kind of family, that character structure, on the one hand, and the Führer ideology, the ideology of powerful, dominating right-wing leadership. Do we have any examples in India? You can use your imagination. The Führer ideology, obviously in Reich's time it referred to Hitler. He says there is a resonance between the authoritarian character structure and Führer ideology. And one of the excerpts that I've sort of put on this sheet explains this very well. He says the reason for the success of this mass organization, by mass organization here, this is the one which says page 29 next to it. It's on page 2. Page 29 it says, the reason for the success of this mass organization, he means by the Nazis. Organization of the masses by the Nazis. Organization of the masses in India by the forces of Hindutva, by the RSS, by the BJP, whatever you like, lies in the masses and not in Hitler. It lies in the masses and not in Modi. His propaganda could take root because of the authoritarian, freedom-fearing structure of the people. Thus, Hitler's sociological importance does not lie in his personality, but in the significance which he is given by the masses. The problem is made all the more acute by the fact that Hitler himself held the masses in thorough contempt. He stated candidly that the mood of the people was always a mere discharge of what was funneled into public opinion from above. It's as if the people are kind of completely subaltern. They have no psychology of their own, no consciousness and will of their own. They are simply like plasticine to be molded by the top-heavy pressure of public opinion. And who controls public opinion, who dominates and shapes public opinion? It's precisely the Führer and his apparatus of power. Through the media today, of course, because the media are immensely more powerful in our day than they were in Hitler's day. So this idea that the real significance of Hitler doesn't lie in his personality, it lies in the meaning attributed to him by the masses, by his followers, by the 17 million people who voted for the Nazis in 1933. It seems to me can be carried over into the Indian situation as well. Perfectly carried over into the Indian situation. What is it that attracts people to these particular political ideologies or movements? What is it that attracts them? Now, Reich's answer lies at all these three levels. The idea that the authoritarian family is absolutely central to the success of fascism, in a sense, reverses the relationship between culture and politics. It is culture that is driving politics, not politics that is molding culture. Okay? So in a sense, Germany is already fascist in the 1920s before it becomes Nazi. Let's put it that way. It doesn't become fascist because it becomes Nazi. It's already fascist and therefore easily turns to the Nazis. That, if you like, and what does it mean to talk about Germany already being fascist? It means look at the nature of German society, the nature of the German family, the nature of German culture, the nature of German ideologies, the nature of the academic intelligentsia in Germany. Why was anti-Semitism so rampant, so deeply rooted? Why are certain forms of communalism, similar equivalent forms of communalism, so rampant, particularly rampant in the middle classes? This aspect, because Reich is always sensitive to the class refraction of ideology. He doesn't abstract from class. He thinks the middle class, the German middle class, is the epitome of the character structure that defines the Nazi, the character structure that defines the Nazi follower. I think personally that's a bit unfair. It's unfair to the middle classes because those character traits are more widely dispersed in the population. But there is an important point. The moment of truth is this, and it was a guy called Zon Rethel who drew it out very well. He was working in business circles in the early 1930s. He had access to information superb, high-quality information about what the Nazis were planning economically and militarily, because he worked in a German think tank in Berlin, and he got to know what the real conversations were within the ruling class, something that most of us would not get to know today, in a comparable way in India, what the real kind of debates and discussions are within the Indian ruling class and so on, within that hard core of it. But what he says is that when he visited the factories, and he had complete access to the factories, he found that one group was absolutely passionate about Hitler. Okay? One particular group, those were the white-collar workers. They were the scientists, the technicians, and the managerial grades, those grades. They lay, as he says, as Zondratel says, between capital and labor. They occupied the intermediate space. But what is that space? It's a space of authority. It was their job to make sure that production continued, that production was not stopped. These are huge, gigantic plants with massive investments in fixed capital. They can't afford to see production being broken, neither due to shortage of raw material, nor due to shortage of markets, nor due to workers' strikes and disruption. Production has to keep going, and it's the job of these intermediate layers within the hierarchy of the plant, the white-collar workers, the managerial supervisory staff, the technicians and the engineers, it's their job to make sure that production keeps running. Now, he says that they were the most passionate advocates and defenders of Hitler. And Zondratel says in this book that the workers used to crack jokes about the Nazis, even about Hitler, on the shop floor. They would crack jokes. That's what I referred to earlier as popular opinion, which you find in a local way, here and there, what people actually say, in the confidence that they're not going to be informed on. Their real thoughts and feelings come out there. So workers would crack jokes about the Nazis and about their bosses and about Hitler. But these characters, they were absolute fanatics. They wore the party badge at work. You're not supposed to, you don't have to wear the party badge at work. They chose to wear the party badge at work. That is how fanatical they were about their Nazism. Okay? Now you can imagine that in fact big business might even have had some liberal spokespersons who in the privacy of their clubs chose to crack similar sorts of jokes about the party and about the Nazis. By the way, it's happening today in Indian business circles vis-a-vis Modi. Okay? Let's not be deluded and think that the capitalist class in India are all kind of absolutely subservient and worshipful. In the privacy of their homes and in the privacy of their clubs, they are capable of a kind of political commentary. I'm not saying it's radical, I'm saying it's from their class standpoint. They are capable of a kind of political commentary which shows that they think there is no governance in this country today. There is no governance occurring in this country today, that the economy is in bad shape, that Modi has no ideas about how to revive the economy, that the only fund of capital he has to kickstart the economy would be if he were to massively cut, this is what business people are saying, if he were to massively cut the subsidies. Politically he can't do that, he can't afford to do that. That is the only capital resource he could unlock if he wanted to, in order to put investment into infrastructure, and therefore for lack of that, he is traveling abroad, passing the hat around, begging capitalists abroad to invest in India. And why should they? I mean, they go by the logic of accumulation. If they think it's a good bet, they'll invest. If they don't think it's a good bet, they won't invest. They won't invest because Modi asked them to, for God's sake. They're not idiots. They're not going to invest because Modi went there and made a presentation of some sort. That's not how capital works. Okay? So let's be clear about this. At each end of the class hierarchy, you might even have quote-unquote popular opinion that could afford to be critical. But in the middle, you had this mass of the Angestellten, the white-collar employees, who were dedicated to Nazism, dedicated to Hitler. Now, I want to ask you whether there is some rough resemblance here to the situation in India today. Okay? I'm just saying to you that whether there is or isn't, because I refer to the issue of patriarchy, of the authoritarian family. We have replicas of that, resonances of that within Indian culture, more deeply rooted traditions of patriarchy in some sense, and not just one tradition of patriarchy. There is the patriarchy of the Khap Panchayats, there's the patriarchy of the urban middle class. The urban middle class would hardly identify itself with the Khap Panchayats, but an important link between the two is patriarchy. It operates in a different way, depending on the setting, depending on the class, depending on narrow class ideologies. It operates in a different way. The language in which it's articulated may well be different, okay? And then one can imagine that there is a caste-based rural patriarchy which affects Dalit communities in this country in particular. So there are multiple patriarchies in India today. But the fact is that if we look at family structures and the nature, the character of the family in India, by and large, the authoritarian family seems to be the one that is most prevalent. I mean, I'm sticking my neck out here, but the authoritarian family, it seems to me, is the epitome of what families are like in India. Even if the form that it takes and the symptoms and the expressions of it are very different here and there. So there are resonances between the argument in mass psychology of fascism and our experience in India. So basically I'm not going to go through all these excerpts and so on. What I want to suggest is that these three motifs, as I call them, the vectors of the argument, when you put them together, they articulate a very powerful vision of the way society works under capitalism. Because we are not talking about pre-capitalist societies, we're talking about our own society. He's saying you cannot understand the authority of the state without the authority of the father. The father is the state in the home, so to speak. The family is a miniature state. The family is a factory for the production of reactionary thinking. Remember, I referred to true thinking and pseudo-thinking. What Reich's term for pseudo-thinking is reactionary thinking. It's a broad label, reactionary thinking. The family is the factory where it's produced. It's produced among children. Brown Miller, in her book on rape, what's the book called? Against Our Will, refers to a phrase that Reich used in the 1940s called the male ideology of rape. So where does the male ideology of rape spring from? It's not taught to people in school. Okay, so where does it come from? It comes from this context, this primordial family background. Okay, the one that we tend to forget as we become 15, 16, 17. Our childhood recedes. Our memories of childhood recede. We forget where we've come from, in some sense. But that is a legacy that can't completely be superseded by us. It lives on in us in a very powerful way, particularly if the homes in which we've grown up display these sorts of character traits. Now, Reich talks about submission to authority as a fundamental character trait of, let me just say something, what he sees as the sort of prototypical Nazi character structure. In Fromm's work, Fear of Freedom, the following are listed as character traits that he personally thought were widespread in the German middle class and probably beyond the middle class. A craving for submission. It's as if you can't lead your own life. You have to have it led by someone for you. A craving for submission. A spirit of blind obedience to a leader. Hatred against racial and political minorities. Remember, these are character traits of the German middle class as Erich Fromm described them in 1942. Exaltation of the German people and the Nordic race. What is all this stuff, this mystifying stuff about Hindu culture, Hindu culture, Hindu culture? All right, it's just an attempt to exalt India as if India is a single ethnicity. All right, as if there is a kind of dominant ethnicity in India to which the term Hindu is given. Hindu is not an ethnicity, but the term Hindu is applied as if there is this ethnicity, exaltation of the Hindu people, of the Hindu race, more openly articulated in Golwalkar's work than it is by anyone today, by the RSS today, because they know this has been said, but they won't say it in those terms because they can't say it in those terms. And then a drive to dominate those who are powerless. Notice this craving for submission coexists with a drive to dominate those who are powerless. Think of the caste system in this country and the way it works at a ground level. So similarly, in Reich's chapters, there are, he characterizes the traits of what he perhaps unfairly says are peculiar character structures peculiar to the middle class, to the German middle class. I think they were more widespread than the German middle class. They were probably found, largely among workers as well. One thing he keeps repeating through the book is that sexually, working class families were freer than middle class families, and I'm willing to accept that. He knows he's talking about something that he saw up front at close quarters, that sexually, he says, they were freer than middle class families. Again, we have to think in terms of Indian society, how sexuality is articulated, how it works in our society, whether there is not, again, a counterpart to this statement within our society, that for certain social groups and classes, maybe cultures of sexual practice are freer, less restrained. less perverted, less distorted, less repressed, less suppressed than they are for the typical middle class family. Okay? But again, these are simply questions. I mean, if you like, it's a kind of research agenda for us to pursue. But these are all fundamentally political issues. It's not as if psychology is here and politics is there. This is what is making Hindutva draw traction from the masses in this country. It is these kinds of issues about authority, about the family, about the father figure, about the articulation of nationalism. I mean, this last excerpt is absolutely brilliant. The last excerpt about what he calls national narcissism. It's brilliant. This is what he says. He uses the term identification for a very important mechanism. Identification. Why do people identify with certain political cultures and political leaders? Identification in Freudian sense. Freud also uses the term. Remember, mass psychology, Freud's term, Massenpsychology, is something that Freud used in a work published in the 1920s, the only time that Freud attempted to understand political and social movements, and he got it badly wrong. He got it badly wrong. That work of Freud's was called Mass Psychology and the Ideal of the Ego. Okay, it was written in 1921 or 1922. The first chapter is the most interesting one because he devotes it entirely to the work of a Belgian psychologist called Gustave Le Bon. And Le Bon was arguing that political leadership requires manipulation of the masses. And you have to learn how to hypnotize the masses in your speech. You have to learn techniques of hypnotism. So the whole of Freud's first chapter is devoted to Le Bon's theory of how leaders try to hypnotize masses when they speak, and whether that succeeds and doesn't succeed. The rest of the book is uninteresting. It's frankly uninteresting, because Freud is treating the mass as if it's somehow intrinsically neurotic, which is not Reich's conception of the mass. Okay? Reich doesn't see the masses as somehow intrinsically neurotic. He sees that they suffer from neuroses. He doesn't deny that. And he tries to understand the roots of those neuroses and also the possible cure for that. So Freud and Reich have very different views of, quote-unquote, the mass. But this is what he says about nationalism at one point, and it's a brilliant passage. The more helpless the individual was made by his upbringing. Notice, individuals being made helpless by their upbringing, the more strongly does he identify with the Führer. Just think of all those images that are flashed across your TV screens of thousands of young people in India, between the ages of 15 and 20 maybe, I don't know. But thousands and thousands of them, even today, at Modi's rallies throughout Bihar. It's the young, the young, the young, the youth, the youth, the youth. Thousands and thousands of them. Think of their upbringing, think of their backgrounds, think of their families, think of what has gone on in those families, of the conflicts that they haven't survived, the struggles and the quarrels that they haven't survived. The more helpless the individual was made by his upbringing, the more strongly does he identify himself with the Führer. The more does the infantile helplessness take the form of the feeling one with the Führer. This tendency to identification is the psychological basis of national narcissism. So Reich suddenly brings nationalism into the picture. If you ask what are the roots of nationalism, this tendency to identification is the psychological basis of national narcissism. That is of a self-confidence. Remember, it's an artificial self-confidence. It doesn't stem from who you are. Okay? Of a self-confidence based on identification with the greatness of the nation. Okay? Proud to be this, proud to be that. You know, proud to be German, proud to be Indian. And then it gets even worse. I remember at one time there was a thing, proud to be Zoroastrian. All right. Idiots were going around in this city, real idiots, after 92, with this slogan on their t-shirts, proud to be Zoroastrian. Who the hell are the Zoroastrians? They're disappearing anyway. What are you proud to be? You know, then proud to be Hindu or proud to be Muslim, whatever it is, the fact is, whether it's sub-national pride or nationalist pride, it's the same bogus self-confidence which stems from helplessness, the helplessness of the individual. Self-confidence based on the identification with the greatness of the nation. The reactionary middle-class individual believes he discovers himself in the Führer, in the authoritarian state. On the basis of this identification, he feels himself the defender of, quote-unquote, the nation. Even though on the basis of this very identification, he despises the masses towards whom he has an individualistic attitude. In other words, the real nation, the country that exists out there, in the slums, in the factories, in the fields, is not what the nation means for this person. Okay? The nation in this sense is a kind of, it's an abstraction. It's an abstraction in the head. He might feel contempt for the real people of that country. His economic and sexual misery is drowned out by the exalting idea of lordship, of domination, and of the genius of the Führer. It makes him forget to what extent he has become an insignificant, uncritical follower. It's a brilliant passage. National narcissism. That's all. Nationalism of any type is narcissism. That's all it is. But its psychological roots lie in this process of identification that Reich is talking about. The helplessness of individuals growing up in certain family backgrounds, the defeat they have suffered. I mean, biographical defeat, biological, psychological defeat they have suffered by the time they reach 14, 15, 16. You know, pseudo-thinking, reactionary thinking, inability to think for yourself, inability to think critically, inability to feel your own emotions in a real way, in a way that is unrestrained, and let alone your ideas about sexuality and you know, how you would handle those. So, I mean, let me draw a halt to it at this point, maybe. Yeah? I think there's enough here for some kind of debate or discussion.
Please. Everybody has to be loud because there's no mic here. And you know, say, please.
I fully agree with your statement that political structure or a structure of the state has something to do with the family structure. I think Indians has noted the same thing in its family, private property and the state. It has directly linked the structure of the family and the structure of the state. However, what I feel is this, if a family structure has to affect directly as a fascist forces, if we take example of Latin America, Ecuador has got highly patriarchal society, but the government there is one of the most liberal government in the world. The same goes for every country in the Latin America. If we see a structure of family structure in Japan, it's highly feudal, but yet the country politically is not yet fascist. What I feel, according to me, it's my personal opinion, what I feel is these fascist forces are always working as an undercurrent in any society, whether it's a communist society, a socialist, or a capitalist. When there is a political vacuum, these fascist forces just comes up like a water jet. That is what my opinion is. I want to have your I may be wrong. Just
Yeah, I'd rather not keep responding because you know, like that kills the discussion. Let people just say what they feel. Yeah.
I have a question. So, you mentioned Germany, the UK. These are countries based on religion. India is a country based on, I would probably say, spiritualism or spirituality, where people in different parts of the country have different beliefs. So, if you say even Hindutva, in Delhi it would be different, in Maharashtra, Gujarat, the structure of families would be different. So, by harping on Hindutva, is it easier to make India a country based on religion and then dominate or rather control the political discussions in the family? I don't know. And it's not very easy to even correlate what happened in Germany to India because of these differences, I would say. That's just.
Yeah, I mean, if you see Hindutva as a kind of religious nationalism, then of the two moments, religion and nation, it's very obvious that the religious component is a pure semblance. I mean, no real integrity corresponds to the religious moment there. It's like a mask. What is really driving the real ideological energy, so to speak, of all this is coming from nationalism. Okay, but it's a nationalism wearing the mask of religion. All right, and therefore having to constantly articulate a kind of religious iconography, symbolism, discourse, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I mean, I may be completely wrong, but I think the energy of the movement comes from a kind of nationalism that corresponds to the, broadly speaking, the stage that Indian capitalism has reached today. It feels it's like the old shackles have been removed. Now it's getting ready for a more aggressive role. It hasn't found an economic strategy yet. It hasn't found an industrial or economic policy as yet. None of that exists, but somehow it's flexing its muscles. Big business in India in the 1990s and 2000s is very different from the kind of business that Nehru was dealing with in the 50s and 60s. This is big business in a more accurate sense of big business. All right, the concentration of capital is huge. Just a handful of business groups dominate most economic policy in this country, and we know the names there very well, etc. So, I don't know, capital flexes its muscles, okay? The kind of, more aggressive nationalism, muscular nationalism that has emerged, especially since the 2000s, it seems to me is partly behind quote-unquote Hindutva. It's got very little to do with religion. They're not interested in that. Of course, there's a big show about being upset and you've hurt my religious sentiment. All that stuff is just a sideshow, frankly. Okay? I mean, it's a complete sideshow. What really matters is the ability to somehow get people to identify. Religion is a mechanism for identifying people with this project.
Please.
You must also be saying it's true that the diversity of India is a problem for the fascists. That has been a problem for them. Because the uniformity of the masses that they want cannot be achieved. But they've been trying for so many decades now to bring out a uniform religion, if you notice. You know that first you have Ram as one god. On the other side, we've always heard that there are 30,000 gods. But there was this attempt to, first of all, make Sri Ram as fair as if he has been using fair and lovely, when he is actually supposed to be dark skin. And you have the warrior image of king and so on. And along with that, Ram, Janmabhoomi kind of thing, they tried quite hard and almost succeeded in making him the prime and unifying Hindu god of the masses. And I was just noticing that recent Ganapati, one of the newspapers carried completely transformed Ganapati, who doesn't have daily. Usually, Ganapati has two things which identify him. One is a particular structure of the eye, which is benevolent. And if you fiddle around with the structure of the eye, the sculptor fiddles around with the structure of the eye, it can easily become frightened. So it's part of the skill of the sculptor, when it's the Ganapati, that the eyes should have a benevolent vision. Then fiddle with that. His chest muscles and abs are both as if he has been attending a gym. And he is altogether looking like a warrior god. Except that, if I remember right, the skin color is the other way around. He's been made a bit darker than usually he's very fair. But these transformations, these are once again attempts to, transform a religion which has been so multi-hued and has had such a glorious history into a more uniform thing and to see how you can militarize the masses and link that militarization to a militant nationalism, which is connected to religion as Hindutva. It's not real religion. And anyway, India has always been, I remember Justice Suresh was saying that we may not have one religion, but it's a state of mind of religiosity. And it's not just the Hindus, the Christians or Muslims, everything. What unites the Indians in terms of religion is extreme religiosity. So that's the right soil, I would say.
It's not just positive symbols. It's also they are trying to build up a hatred against the community. It's like Hindu community shares hatred against Muslims, what we don't want, hatred against Christians, and vice versa. So it defines both positively as well as negatively. The larger basis, I think, more than one is sacred symbols that they use, yes. The other is also hatred of this unity, Hindu unity or Muslim unity or whatever unity is built up.
It may not be on the terrain of indigenous. It's on census and this.
I tell you, if I, just a quick comment that in my experience, what has really kind of seen a resurgence or just a surge, perhaps maybe it wasn't there, is nationalism within the middle classes, within the Indian middle classes. I mean, I don't remember the middle classes in India being so fiercely nationalistic in the 1970s, for example. When this broke, when the kind of landslide occurred, I don't know, but in the post-liberalization era, by the 90s and 2000s, a whole new generation of the middle class has come up, who must have been kids maybe in the 70s and 80s. You know, now they're in full-time employment, maybe they run their own businesses, etc., etc. They're people in their 40s. They're ferociously nationalist. Not necessarily in a very crude, overt way, but if you scratch the skin a bit, then this nationalism comes out in a big way. That, it seems to me, is a big ideological change.
Yeah. After that,
I received
I've seen the hands.
the internet copy of the book just a few days back, and I was struggling to it. I haven't read all of it, but perhaps one-third of the book, one-third of it. I was trying to think what is the book going to be, and I found that it is, in some ways, my approach is broadly Marxian, and you should say that. And while this is a Marxian approach, but it was a bit different from the way that I was used to seeing things. So I set myself thinking about where I disagree, and I would also ask you that question, where you disagree with Wilhelm Reich. I was wondering whether this type of emphasis on the family and early socialization as in some ways related to state structures and power structures, whether it's engaging with a certain type of reductionism, where one could possibly have more obvious explanations, something that people have been saying, obvious explanations to the character of the state, to the rise of a particular authoritarian personality and all that. But the point made that authoritarianism from the state needs a certain receptivity in the masses. That is, I think, an important point and well taken.
Yeah.
But that this receptivity can be reduced to early family upbringing. I don't know whether it might have held true in Wilhelm Reich's time in 1930s. I wonder whether it holds true today, given the diversity of upbringings and things like that.
Okay.
Anyhow,
Just in connection,
I'd like to hear from you where you disagree.
Wait a minute.
in connection with his.
I've seen hands now, please.
In connection with his.
I'll tell you.
I was just thinking of the same thing, when Reich was.
If you could be louder, are all of you able to hear him?
The patriarchal structure of the family, and he gave more emphasis on stress on that. So, if we are trying to think in terms of recent times, whether in India or in the West, what we see that the families are, the very composition, the social construction of family is getting disintegrated. And in the sense that, it might be true, one can just accept what Mr. Reich is saying, that the first familiarity of authority, the first lesson of power, that is, introduced in the family structure, even at that time and even today. But still, just the familiarity, the learning, the exposure or engagement with that power and authority is possible or was possible in the family. But giving too much emphasis or over-emphasis on the family by neglecting the, and very large impact or encompassing control of the state, because the state is more like an octopus. So whether terms of this, octopusian character of the state.
So, as a layperson, I'm convinced the relation between the authoritarian family and fascism. But this discussion about psychoanalysis, it seems that science has come to a rescue for left-wing people like us, wherein psychoanalysis has been done for analyzing fascism. So I want to ask whether now that these people are doubting or they are skeptical whether really authoritarian family has a role to play in fascism. And when people like Reich, they do psychoanalysis, whether psychoanalysis is pure science or is it like economics, wherein your own ideology plays because there are economists who very much differ with each other. But if it's pure science, then there is very less room to dissent. So why are psychoanalysts, if I may say, differ so vehemently against each other when the Reich is relating authoritarian family to fascism? Isn't there like a foolproof analysis done by him or any other thinker after him to directly relate authority? He has done it in this book, obviously, but are there studies for it?
Well, let me just, if I can take these
Yeah,
three
please.
quickly.
Yeah.
Should I take them?
Yeah, please do that.
Just, first of all, the International Association has completely erased the complicity of Freud's colleagues, the psychoanalysts practicing in Germany in the 1930s, with the Nazi state. That's what Peglau's book is about. Not only was their public posture conformist, in other words, they were terrified of saying anything about the Nazis, but they actively collaborated with the regime. For example, they constructed diagnostic models as to who was pathologically fit to be exterminated. Okay? This eugenics program, the Nazis' eugenics program. They actively collaborated, constructing according to various criteria, supposedly derived from their own psychoanalytic work, as to who was irretrievably neurotic, who was irretrievably psychotic, etc., etc. All these labels that they were using. So I'm not saying all of them were equally complicit, but the mainstream of psychoanalysis among German professionals was of this type, conformist and complicit. Okay? And the association has never breathed a word about this till today. No one is asking them for an apology, just acknowledge it as a fact that this is what your people were doing. All right? So that's the first point. Secondly, after the 1920s, psychoanalysis as a profession went through a major transformation. It became largely medicalized. Medicalized in the sense that it was reduced to the level of sort of like you're dealing with disease. You're not dealing with experience, with human experience, with depression in the sense of a Lebenswelt, of a world you inhabit and so on, but more like the way you try and cure a disease. Okay? And of course, it became an extremely well-paid profession. Okay? So thoroughly institutionalized, America became the paradigm case. You see it in Hollywood movies all the time, people lying on couches talking to their psychoanalysts and so on and so forth. Okay? So it went through a complete bourgeois transformation. What Peglau is saying is that for Reich, it was essentially a political discipline. Because of the statements it was making about the child, about childhood sexuality, about authority in the family, and about the way human character is molded and shaped. It was a profoundly, potentially political subject. Freud resisted that politicization of psychoanalysis, partly because of his own positivism. In other words, he saw psychoanalysis as a science and politics as somehow out there. Not science, opposed to science. And he wanted to rigorously maintain this distinction between science and politics. Reich's whole tendency was to politicize the science, to say, yes, it is a science to the extent that it tells us something about the human psyche. It tells us something about ourselves. And there are procedures and methods and so on for doing so. To that extent, yes. But also it has a political message to convey to humanity. A political message that was obliterated, that was lost, completely wiped out. So it's a completely depoliticized, positivistic, medicalized profession today. Today. It's wretched. It's nothing like the kind of profession that Reich was pursuing in the 1930s. Okay? Regarding these 2 points, don't read Reich as if he's constructing a theory of the state. Okay? I'm talking about one text, Mass Psychology of Fascism. I'm talking about one kind of state, the authoritarian state. Fascism is an extreme form of the authoritarian state. Fortunately, we don't have an extreme authoritarian state as yet in India, which is why we are able to assemble here and debate like this. Okay? But, so Reich was talking about the authoritarian state, and he was highlighting what he saw as a crucial dimension of it, namely what the instance of matter, the moment of matter in Marxist sense of matter, was that of a life energy that was being controlled and contained and manipulated in some way, okay? Which is our, it's our sexuality in the broad sense. Okay, for Reich, infantile sexuality is a large part of the answer of how an authoritarian state is able to reproduce itself, to survive, through the kind of character structures that are ultimately molded by that, yeah.
I've seen 6 hands, and you can come in whenever you like. Okay, I've seen you. I've seen all hands, in fact. One after the other, please.
Would you please comment on caste character of Indian fascism?
I'm not the best person to comment on that. I mean, I'm sure there are people here who can say much more insightful things about that.
Okay. You.
Caste, no? Caste. No, yeah, not class, caste.
Yeah, talking about caste.
That's a big progress that we're now talking about.
Okay.
The way you are invoking right? I think the early writers also from Frankfurt School are extremely useful, relevant today. Both in fact, concept of culture industry, for example, another concept of centrally and totally administered society, as he was saying, one-dimensional man and one-dimensional authoritarian personality. They seem to now characterize our lives not so, not in that identical manner, but it does continue to move towards that kind of direction. And in that context, I thought, to get back to, for example, a broader kind of generation that we are building. Now, this generation that is denied of right to say no, meaning broadly, we were already entering into the light, which multiple cultural industries, both Hindutva cultural industries and other kind of cultural industries, also globalization, consumer cultural industries, all of them are producing together a kind of beings without right to say no. And that perhaps uncritically then leads to a construction of identities which are given to you, this kind of ready-made identities which are given to you, through which you start naming yourself and being in the world. Now that perhaps also gets translated or is also in the family. For example, again, we are investing too much into family now. And hence family has become so much important. That your children are your new kind of investment, and this investment basically then is very clearly, or that's the route to link that to a particular kind of nationalism, a particular kind of, in fact, so to say, so therefore it is necessary once again to engage with family. I think there is that kind of a very clear kind of connection exists. Now, as to your remark about why, for example, left did not dwell on culture or did not take cultural politics seriously. I think Govind Pansare was trying to do that. And therefore he becomes threat to a particular kind of Hindutva cultural politics. So all those who take cultural politics seriously, they run possibility of questioning and, in that sense, dismantling this kind of a hegemonic Hindutva, who can therefore fascist kind of force, and therefore they have to be killed. So, but Govind Pansare and others have been killed primarily for this kind of force. The only thing perhaps that left, though, was trying to build also in terms of cultural politics. They were, in a way, providing a kind of alternative culture, but that culture broadly also was culture which denied a right to say no. So whether the alternative culture was also a kind of another ready-made
yes, I mean, while it is critical, but whether it also leads to, this is the way we name ourselves. And in that sense, there is eventually creeping in the field where you have lost the right to say no. So whether that, I think that criticality also continues to characterize the idea of alternative culture.
See, just a footnote to what you're saying, Reich's term for the public manipulation of religion, which is very widespread in India, by the way, is mysticism.
Yeah.
It would be wrong to read Reich as saying that religion per se is mysticism. He's talking about the way religion is used politically, culturally, ideologically. And that is the tendency that Dhavolkar and Kalburgi and so on were confronting.
Yes.
That, you know, so in a real sense, that's Reich's mysticism in India. And I'm shocked by the widespread culture of gullibility in this country. You have godmen and godwomen and so on and so forth, and especially up in the north maybe. I don't know, maybe not so much in the south. But the whole North Indian landscape is one of all these bogus godmen and godwomen and so on. What it reflects more seriously is cultures of gullibility. Where do those cultures come from? Why are people being trained to be gullible instead of being trained to be critical? So absolutely the rationalists are part of this emancipatory trend, insofar as they do elaborate a kind of cultural politics which is hitting home quite hard, as we can see. You know, clearly it's grating against their sensibilities because they're being assassinated. But you know, don't read Reich as if he's developing a theory of the state. He's not. I mean, my one criticism of it is when he discusses the non-neurotic kind of context within which mass activity takes place. He doesn't make it to the level of clarity that you find in Sartre's work. Because for Sartre, there's a fundamental group between being unorganized, fragmented, dispersed, what he calls a series, between being seriality and being organized in a group. There's a big difference between the two. The same individuals may be in a series and may be in a group, they'll behave very differently. Okay? That distinction between the kind of fragmented experience of the isolating, powerless experience of being part of a series and the kind of empowering experience of being in a group is not articulated in Reich's work so clearly. I mean, it's even worse in Freud, because as far as Freud is concerned, every mass is neurotic. Whereas what Reich is saying is that if you look at workers, working class communities and so on, they are not actually the way Freud is portraying them. They have a confidence in their skills, but that is the most he ever gets to. Talking about the skilled worker's confidence in his skill is about the most he'll ever get to distinguish the non-manipulated mass from the kind of self-organizing, self-emancipated mass, which is the mass which will make revolutions ultimately. We don't have it so far, but that is the mass that drives history forward, no? The one that organizes itself democratically, that is the basis of democracy.
Let us be now leftist. All hands have been coming from right. I'll come to that later. There are various hands from this side.
Maybe you are right.
That's why it always, you know, right and left is defined by. Okay. Yeah. You probably wanted to say something, right? Okay. She has been raising her hand rather more ferociously. Louder, yes.
Regarding mass psychology, I mean, is he just looking at the sex poles that you talked about and just studying the people coming there, or is he looking at certain rebellions or risings or certain moments, important moments? Also, what does he mean by masses? I mean, does he qualify what masses are? When he's talking about the mass psychology, what masses is he really about?
Yeah. Well, basically, the book was written against the background of his sex ball work. Okay? So he is beginning to get a sense of what Nazism is like, really, in terms of the kind of problems that he's encountering in the clinics. There are issues to do with authority in the home, with abortion, with masturbation. For example, part of his sex ball work is to produce pamphlets for youth, and a lot of Reich's active political involvement is with youth, with German youth. Something which the KPD, the German Communist Party, resented because he had enormous popularity with the young in Germany. And So like 50 questions and answers. Is masturbation dangerous? So Reich will answer that. Question, is masturbation dangerous? They've been brought up they've been told by the church, they've been told in the family that it is. It's damaging in various ways, etc. So Reich answers all of these questions in a simple way. Or questions about abortion, questions about sexual health, questions about, whatever, the kind of problems that people encounter in terms of day-to-day experience of sexuality, of the home, of domestic violence, all of it is coming out in the clinics. Now, what he is doing is constructing a notion of how all of this is feeding into a widespread neurosis within German society. And that neurosis for him is the root cause of German fascism. That doesn't mean there are not other causal factors operating. He's not saying that the economic crisis doesn't have anything to do with it. The economic crisis profoundly impacts the vulnerability of families in Germany at the time. So it's not as if he would be a fool to say it doesn't matter. It does matter. But he's looking at mediations which in some sense are more profound, less obvious. Okay? Because all of Marxist method is ultimately about mediations. What we talk about, the dialectic is, if you like, the science of mediations. It's the method of mediations. Everything in human life mediates everything else. You can't talk about the family without talking about society and about schools. You can't talk about the state without talking about families and etc., etc. These interdependencies that we see, these circularities, are what the dialectic is all about ultimately. So he is focusing on one type of mediation, the one where human energies, the energies that flow through our lives, so to speak, become susceptible to control and manipulation in various ways. He doesn't construct a formal methodology of any type. I mean, it's not that kind of work. It's typically a political pamphlet. The length is misleading. Most of this was written much later. The original length of the Mass Psychology of Fascism is about 1/3 of this. Only 8 chapters, the original length. Then he expanded it massively later on.
Just thinking of the resonance of that period with what's happening in India, and one of the one of the 3 keys of this work is to talk about why working class buy into or allowed to be mobilized against their own economic interests. And thinking about it in these terms, thinking about it in our context here, and I'm sure it was true then also, the situation, economic crisis, and they didn't believe that they were buying against, into being mobilized against their own economic interests. In fact, they believed that their economic interests would be, their economic situations would be alleviated by the so-called Achhe Din and the whole Vikas kind of, thing. And that, I think, is also somewhere in the context I'm wondering at what point, and given our electoral histories, it's like the masses, if they found themselves disillusioned with the economic performance, if you will, of the government in power, they get thrown out the next general election. I'm wondering what is different here. Has the identification with the Führer, in terms of exceeded their investment in their own economic interest in right now? I'm not wondering what is the situation right now? Are we moved away from the time where the masses, although we do hear talks among the public of the disillusionment of the various price rises and everything that is affecting the masses thing. I'm not sure whether that is going to stay at the level of popular opinion, that kind of talk amongst themselves, and they continue to be. I'm wondering at what phase will that not matter?
I'll tell you, I'll stick my neck out and say I think the answer is youth. Youth. I think the key factor, and this is the big difference, largely the big difference between the RSS and Modi. If you look at their social profiles, Modi is appealing to a large element within Indian society which the left has completely failed to communicate with. It has no language for communicating with that element. For whatever reason, that's a separate debate. Why the left fails so abysmally. But Modi is able to appeal to them by selling them a kind of modernist vision of India. It's actually pseudo-modernist, but let's say it's not seen as such. It's a modernist vision of India, which is attracting them. Now, these are lower middle class. They're from, I don't know how to characterize them. They're not necessarily employed working class families. They're not necessarily employed in a full-time sense. They may be from the casual labor sector. But there are millions and millions of households in this country, somewhere between full employment and middle class comfort. Let's put it that way, the two poles. You know, full employment in the sense of you're actively employed in some big company or factory somewhere in a blue-collar job. That is very rare nowadays. It used to be quite common in the 70s. And on the other hand, middle-class comfort is the kind of illusion that the advertisers constantly sell on television. You know, the standard nuclear family buys a car for Diwali. You know, the child comes and actually hugs the car. All right. You know, you've seen this latest ad, Honda ad or whatever. So that between those two poles of being a regular permanent employee in Siemens or Philips or wherever, and middle-class comfort, between those two poles lie millions and millions of families who are in precarious work or no work at all, who are struggling to survive, who are, you know, unless their dads belong to the BMC, they're not going to get a job. I mean, in the BMC, it's a rule that if your dad is in the BMC, you're going to get a job. One male child in the family will get a job, okay? But unless you're a BMC employee, no one else has any assurance of work. So youth, and Modi consciously targets them, The RSS, it seems to me, is has a very different social profile. As much as they try and draw young people into their shakas and so on, that is not, the social profile, it seems to me, the age profile is also different. It's worth investigating this, but there are two different constituencies being addressed by the same movement here in very different languages and very different ways. And maybe there is an underlying tension between the two politics, between the RSS Supremo, what's his name, Bhagwat? Or,
yeah, Bhagwat,
Mohan Bhagwat on the one hand and Modi on the other. But as for buying into movements which are against that, you're saying they perhaps think that they are in their economic interests to the extent that they think they're really going to get jobs, to that extent. But I mean, in every other way, I mean, it would have made more sense to see that trade unions are associations that have actively struggled for the economic welfare of working people in this country. They're known to have struggled for the economic welfare. Why not devote your life to a trade union? Why not join a union and etc.? Why go after all this? Why hanker after this? So, I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying one part of the picture lies with the young. And, he's able to appeal to young people in a way that the left has completely failed to do.
Okay, you want to say? Yeah. I'll come to you. I've seen you, I've seen this side. I'll come to everybody. Please go ahead.
The family structure which you were talking about, the authoritarian family structure, somehow, like what we have read so far or understood so far, the development of family has been in tandem with the development of the society, like how the society developed. Then we came from the early, whatever, like he was referring to Engel's book, Family, Private Property and State. We have read that, and that's how the families have developed. And it has still not, it's not disconnected from the society in that way. It's like, again, that dialectical thing. They have continuous give and take, and they somehow implement each other's agendas into, like, the society helps the family, and the family somehow implements the social understanding of things. And more or less, all these things are guided by the economic
interest
aspect of the entire thing. So, especially when you see, like, even in why I'm talking about the society here is, suppose you take education. What we study right now is the same, in our education structure, the same authoritarian thing that you're talking about, the family, is implemented. Like, when you go to a school, it's a common, you go there to learn. somehow they instill it in you. So it's somehow the society is doing it, and it's doing it to create a larger section of working people who don't ask questions, like who just follow what is being given to them. So why is this being done? Because when they implement their agenda, their economic agenda, you are not there to question. And how they're dividing it is they're using the again the family and the society and the social structures into this. So somehow
Who is they? Who is they? Good. They were also children at one time.
Yeah, but the children you're talking about, if you're talking about the children, the development of children who are going to go with fascist forces, those children are being, you said the family is teaching them, but I'm saying it's also a part of the social training which is coming through, and it is being impacted or it's being guided by the economics. Like you said, the culture is deciding the politics, which is true. But again, right now, what the culture we see, at least the popular culture that we see, the culture that is reflected as Indian culture in most of the section, it is again the imposed culture. It's like imposed because of the economic.
See, if you have that sort of economic evolutionism model, you'll find it hard to explain why, as capitalism grows in India, caste remains alive and kicking, patriarchy remains alive and kicking. These institutions have not disappeared. There is a temptation to therefore explain this as an alternative to explain this in terms of a conspiracy theory. To say that therefore there is someone in society that has deliberately kept caste alive and patriarchy alive because it suits their interest to do so.
But it is not clashing with the interest of the economic.
No.
It's not clashing.
What clashes with the interests of most of the workers who vote for Modi is that in terms of economic program, he is infinitely closer to capital than to labor. All right. Correct. He has n number of times had photo ops with Ambani and Adani and so on and so forth. He has hardly ever had photo ops with ordinary groups of workers. Okay? So it's clear what message he was sending out. Then there was a backlash in the media. People said, this guy is just a chamcha of Ambani and so on. Someone must have told him. I suspect the RSS told him, go slow with this. Don't have yourself photographed so often with Ambani and so on. Go slow. Okay? There was a backlash. Maybe around the time of that famous Australia visit, when he twisted the arm of the SBI CEO and told her that you've got to fund this project for Adani. All right. Then there was a whole spate of criticism in the papers and the media and so on about, you're giving a loan of 1 billion to a project which is not viable, which none of the financial institutions are touching worldwide. There was a lot of criticism. After that, I suspect there's been a slight kind of reconfiguring of public relations image. You don't see him nowadays so much in the company of Ambani, so much in the company of Gautam Adani and so on. But it's well known that that is the camp that Modi stands with. Okay? Not with labor. All right. Unlike, for example, I'll give you an analogy, unlike Perón in Argentina, who was always seen as a popular politician with close links with labor and with the working class in Argentina. Everyone knew that ultimately he was going to service the needs of domestic capital in Argentina. But that didn't seem to matter. The man was popular with workers, and the workers had no suspicions about Perón. Modi is not a figure like that. No. So to the extent that workers vote for Modi, all right, they're voting for a politician who is known to have close links with big business. You see, that's what I'm saying by this cleavage that Reich talks about between economics and ideology. All right. They're ideologically and politically they're going one way. Economically, they should be going completely in the other way. No, meaning it's not in their interests. It's not in their economic interest to support people like this. Huh?
How is it clashing with their
Oh,
interest?
don't you worry when
Implementing their agenda here, and without any doubt, when we talk about the social movements and all those things, they don't come up because there are 50. They have their own agenda of divide and rule.
Probably what she wants to say is there is a large section in Ahmedabad which has fed themselves on IT sector. That middle class is now mostly surviving on that IT sector or service sector. That class is pretty much happy with Modi, I guess so. So I guess she's talking about that class.
Yeah.
Okay.
Workers, of course, Modi has alienated himself from workers.
Yeah.
But there is hardly, I mean, very less number of worker class in India as of now. All of them are mostly contract workers. So,
all of them are what? All of them are what?
He's talking to children, not directly now. He's capturing children in a way.
Okay. There are 3 hands. 1, 2, 3. Any here? Okay. 3 hands. Yeah. Please.
I think it would be a great mistake to say that the RSS has no resonance among the youth. In fact, they are the ones who have taken young from childhood people most seriously. And Modi himself is a product of that. And I think today when we think of family in India, we have to think of some parivar as well as somehow part of the family, the way their children are brought up and channeled from a very early age to hate the other, who is defined in various ways, usually by community and caste, and but also other. I wanted to say that in my mind the current issue which seems to have most resonance with what Reich is talking about in terms of linking family, sexuality, and fascism is what is commonly called moral policing. I mean, it is very, there is a collusion, active collusion between families and various right-wing groups to enforce a certain way in which young people may or may not relate to other young people. They very rigorously crush any kinds of relationships which go outside the community, outside the caste that they are supposed to be within. And it seems to me that here too is the place where perhaps an anti-communal, anti-fascist cultural politics, sex rights type could perhaps originate. That obviously this starts from childhood, in fact, that young people are told these are the, you have to marry according, you cannot marry a person according to whom you choose. It has to be a person of the right caste, the right religion, the right gender. We will tell you. And you will not go outside that. And if you have friendships which tend in that direction, then we will come down very heavily and up to the point of killing you. If you transgress. So this is where maybe one would have a kind of politics, because that's very clearly aligned with the right.
Okay. You want to
no one's mentioned sexual violence, for example.
Yes.
I mean, India has a rampant culture of sexual violence.
Yes.
How is that connected with the politics, with the mainstream, political mainstream in this country? Does it feed into the growth of the right in some way? If so, how? It's an issue which hasn't been, it seems, huh? Well, what is the connection, so to speak, between our prevailing political culture and these cultures of sexual violence in the country? You know.
I think it's more to do with a certain section of the very youth which doesn't find proper employment and is probably not educated at all, hardly educated, but especially in the urban area. There are different forms of it. In the rural area, the kind of feudal, feudal claims of certain aristocratic families,
have another party. It's too small.
which might have been carried on to certain bourgeoisie usage, which are lingering forms. That's one thing. We are talking about the entire, if you're talking about the nuclear kind of rape, that's
Well, let me just say, I think the elephant in the room, the elephant in the room is all those constraints that are placed on freer sexual relationships among the young in India, among the Indian youth. Okay? Multiple constraints, like Rohini says about, not allowed to choose, to have friends of your own choice. Whether that's determined in terms of community, family, class, whatever it is, not being allowed to have friends of your own choice. Not being allowed to, for example, go out up to certain hours or beyond certain hours. Okay? This rigorous moral policing that takes place, not just with the kind of so-called fringe groups, publicly attacking couples, young couples and so on, but also the internal policing that occurs through the family, through the authoritarian family. Then, various cultures that reprimand young people, and suggest that somehow it's unnatural to have sexual relationships until you're a certain age or until you are of marital status and so on and so forth. So there are n number of ways in which a society based on a freer set of sexual relationships is being destroyed, which could potentially emerge. And as far as I'm concerned, the lack of a cultural politics on the part of the radical or the revolutionary left in this country connects with this point. Connects with this point and also accounts for their complete catatonic attitude to the young. They cannot speak to the young. All right. No wonder you've got this huge gap. The young are going this way. And if you look at the age profile of most of the left parties, the big left parties, forget the leadership. I mean, the leadership is way beyond. But even that kind of next rung of leadership, Sitaram Yechuri is relatively young maybe in Indian left terms, but he's the same age as me, for God's sake. All right. I'm talking about the youth, late teenagers, in your 20s, not past 30. That potentially radical constituency, the people who are leading the fight in the FTII, in Jadavpur University, and in various, educational milieu, who are sustaining remarkable struggles. These are struggles for control over the workplace, struggles which are questioning managerial authority, questioning government appointments, amazing struggles, but the left is not in the picture. Okay, so I'm saying the youth are potentially a subversive element in any society in the world. Potentially a subversive element. They can feed into emancipatory movements, but they're just not feeding into the left in this country.
Yeah. Two more hands.
Why this movement like Renaissance?
Kindly speak loudly.
Why movement like Renaissance it would take place in our country? Do you think with the cultural domain, which you are talking about, is a real impediment? A real impediment is because culture is your destiny. Culture does not have a stagnant philosophy. It is a very much important.
Did you refer to Renaissance? You said Renaissance.
Renaissance. Because we are talking about some sort of rational perspective. Perspective plays a major role in the nation. So this sort of notion, why it is not coming? When we talk about secularism, European secularism also talks about rationalism. And rationalism comes from this inculcation of scientific temper, or what we say, which really is sort of hardly in our country some reform here and there, but it was died down. It does not have a real impact on our real change in our society.
Related question.
Yeah.
Throughout your speech, sir, I couldn't help but remember this book by Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Yeah.
And I think if Mr. Reich has diagnosed the problem, I think the solution to that problem of revolutionizing the public education system, which was mentioned, I think both can be read together.
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, when I say cultural politics, I mean in the broadest sense of pedagogy, family, sexuality, in that broad sense, that you can't have political emancipation and ignore all of this, because it makes no sense. I mean, it's like there's a synergy between them. You know, as all the student rebellions of the 1960s and early 70s show you, there was always a synergy between them. You know, what was it? Put imagination in command, all that stuff. You can't keep culture here and politics there. And ultimately, the only movement that was able to put culture forefront was feminism. You know, and even the kind of protest movements that developed.
Blacks
Yes, you're right. Yes.
France Fanon,
Okay. Final point from her.
Absolutely enjoyed the
Loudly, please.
presentation as well. But I completely agree with the importance of reading texts very closely and recovering and unpacking their meaning. But I also resonate with the idea you just mentioned before the last question of being able to articulate these ideas perhaps in newer terms than fascism, etc. Because somehow I find that people immediately close their minds these days when you even mention like half a word in that direction. But and the right, for instance, is being very innovative. For instance, nowadays I found people saying be positive and don't be so negative. You know, they come up with newer ways that people identify with more easily. Perhaps a lot more creativity is required, and I find myself at a loss, quite frankly. But I think if we can think more innovatively and perhaps more empirically grounded ways to articulate these kind of concepts and theories.
Well, I mean, I think if we can develop the sort of imagination that helps to make our notion of democracy concrete, because if there's one thing in terms of which the political marketplace is just completely flooded, it's the use of the word democracy. No one will say they're anti-democratic, all right? Or even the BJP positions itself as a defender of democracy. And they get very upset if they're accused of fascism. They say fascism is the emergency. For them, the emergency is fascism. If anyone says you are actually fascist, and they get quite upset by that. Now, democracy, democracy, democracy. As long as it remains some kind of cliche, or just a buzzword, or some abstraction, okay? You know, our ability to actually articulate the sense of democracy, the meaning of democracy, and a vision of democracy in a concrete, practical way will partly at least solve this problem of communication and language. Because ultimately we're talking about a language of democracy. If it remains a cliche or an abstraction, then it's not going to be anything. It's useless. Everyone swears by the cliche.
Even something like democracy, for instance, inherent in it is this danger of, like Hannah Arendt would say, the biggest genocides happen in a democracy. So, I don't know if, I'm sure, democracy now and all those movements, but that itself, there's a danger inherent in it when the nation can become the state.
Well, what's actually happened is that Amit Shah, the trajectory of Amit Shah, is the perfect embodiment of the destruction of democracy. The perfect embodiment. I mean, democracy in Gujarat was hollowed out, completely hollowed out. The only people who fought for justice were the victims and people like Zakia Jafri. They were struggling for the actual retention of democracy against a state government that was determined to uproot it completely. So Gujarat is a perfect example of a state without democracy. If there's one state in India without democracy, it's Gujarat. What democracy? And it fits perfectly with that, I don't know, IT sector, Ahmedabad middle class and so on. The middle class are like that today in India. They've lost any sense of where their country came from. Their country came from the struggle for democracy. That's where their country came from. They've lost all sense of that. They're suffering from a terrible historical amnesia. Again, I blame the left for that, for not emphasizing sufficiently the significance and importance of having a culture of democracy in this country. I mean, democracy means different things. It means the ability to resist and so on and so forth. But, you know, the basic meaning it has is at least our constitutional rights. And those have been completely wiped out with all these encounter killings and genocidal attacks and so on, completely wiped out. Amit Shah is the living antithesis of democracy. Every time I see him, I think, oh my God, democracy is gone. He shouldn't be there. He shouldn't be up there. He should be behind bars, at least awaiting trial.
Yeah.
You want to say something?
I'm trying to end it. So no, vote
Yeah,
of
no.
thanks by you, but
You want to say something? Yeah.
yeah, we had a good discussion. All of us want to continue, obviously, but without your energies, we won't be able to continue. How do we get your energy? Two ways. Twitter, CSSS, peace. That's our Twitter handle. Suggest there. Send your suggestions for topics on which study circles should be organized.
Discussions like this.
For discussions like this.
Correct.
Or at css.mumbai@gmail.com. Any email?
Yeah. Yes, it has.
IIVSNL.
IIE@VSNL.com.
IIE Pune.
.net.
Pune.
IIE.Pune.
IIE Pune.
IIE Pune at VSNL.net.
Write it
You should
down
just
there.
send out
Okay.
these addresses to everyone on the list, no? On the
If anybody has not entered your name in register, we may not be able to contact you. We would want to maintain contact with every one of you. So please see that your contact details are in that register and in legible handwriting. Sometimes, in doctors' handwritings, if they are there, and yes, emails are very sensitive. Whatever between dots and etc. etc. Okay. So we would like to continue next month. We'll have another discussion. We want some young people to volunteer to help to continue this. There are some books there. You can have a look at those books. Some are for sale. Some maybe secular perspective and all are just for distribution if you like. So yeah, and Sharadji will now.
Yeah, good. I have a very pleasant task of thanking everybody and sort of making a few comments. First, of course, I came from Bhopal to listen to you. Okay, and I find it quite rewarding. You know, I was drawn into psychoanalysis or psychology because of my fascination for Freud in 1950s. And so I studied quite a lot of psychoanalysis and psychology. But you know, I have been out of touch also. I was in some other job. But it has been very fascinating. I therefore suggest that we clap for him. He has been very, very articulate in presenting a very complex subject. One. Comment number two. I noticed in the discussion a sense of optimism. You know, somehow there is a kind of suggestion that let us reflect whether we are reaching the same kind of situation as existed in Germany then. And there is a kind of a denial, if I say, from the group. If you notice the kind of discussion that was being made, there's some kind of a denial. No, we have not reached that stage. And it was being presented in very different ways. But there was a kind of a denial. And that shows optimism. Third, the family issue has touched many cards. And I think there was a lot of ideas or points on that, which probably goes to serve that there is a lot of truth in the point made by Reich in this respect. Fourthly, I think there is a cause for optimism. After all, let's recollect. Despite the mass hysteria of today being generated by the media mainly, they had got only 31% vote. So, you know, even amongst the voters, there is a substantial majority, not only more than 50, substantial majority which did not fall, except is not a part of that mass hysteria yet. And therefore, probably there is a need for us to focus on that and do something. Next point. I was trying to note down a few points he mentioned. Sometimes he only indirectly indicated. There are lots of things that require to be studied. I don't know whether Kishore you could make a note of it, but lots of points. If we are saying that even if we have not reached the situation that Germany was in, we are probably on the verge of it. Does our family replicate this or not? There are many things that require really study, research. They are not just matters of opinion that we infer. So maybe, since you are suggesting this, I'll request all of you, all those who respond in the mail, and suggest the kind of studies that require to be made. That would be extremely interesting, and I can take up some of those studies. You can take some of the studies, and you can always find many other people who would be interested in such studies. So I think this discussion is only the beginning for many studies that can be made, and I found many of them fascinating. I would like to sort of start a series of research on this. And then finally, I would also like to say that the point that was made, ultimately education, the radical, even if you talk about the family, the counterpoint was proper public education, right? Where instead of cramming, instead of obedience, we have just the radicalization we think of, which is our main job. And I think therefore, probably there is also a need to enter into the area of education, not just for the purpose of that, but really how do we radicalize education. I think I'll thank all of you. The whole discussion was so stimulating. They're bringing this little snack right in the beginning. I said, no, let there be proper intellectual discussion first. Otherwise, it does come in the way. I suspect that if it had not come now, we may still have been continuing our discussion. And that would have been better. For me, that would have been better. But I found impatience in the organizers to get it early. Okay, so thank you all very much for this very lively, stimulating discussion. And above all, thanks to you for this great presentation and stimulation to all of us. Thanks. There was no pseudo thinking. I found all of you doing thinking rather than pseudo thinking. For that, all of you need to be congratulated.
Yeah, before we disperse, I would like to invite you all to the Astarari public lecture by Professor Romila Thapar. The lecture is on Indian society and the secular. It is happening on the 26th of October at 5 p.m. at Darbar Hall at the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, which is at Fort. Professor Romila Thapar will be delivering the lecture, and it will be chaired by Professor Jairus. So you are all invited.
And we also have a Facebook group, Mumbai Study Circle. Kindly send joining requests if you are on Facebook. We will accept that, and we can have our discussion. We can continue our discussion.
Oh, wow. You've got a copy of it.
Yeah, I got a copy. I got it last like
Your
3
book?
years back. So I missed the last session when you came.
It's a collection of essays. What's your name?
My name is Sadendra. SUDH.
Oh, I've said 4. Should I just say
Whatever you want.
Yeah?
You are happy?
Yeah?
You are happy, I'm saying? It has been recorded.
SUDH.
Now you can use it.
ENDU.
END or A?
U.